Johnny Carson, the smooth-talking, cigarette-wielding, poker-faced king of late-night television for 30 electrifying years, built a career on charm, timing, and control, famously able to interview anyone from world leaders to the animal handlers without breaking a sweat, commanding the stage of The Tonight Show with an effortless blend of sarcasm, silliness, and silence that said more than most comedians could dream of. But even Carson, with his polished image and unmatched poise, had moments when the mask cracked, the tension slipped through, and what unfolded live in front of millions was not a rehearsed routine or comic bit, but a real, raw, human clash. And those moments, rare, unplanned, and unforgettable, became legend, not because they were but because they revealed that even the most composed man on television could be pushed to his limit, like the time Don Rickles, the insult comic and one of Johnny's longtime friends, broke his beloved cigarette box while guest hosting, and Johnny, returning the next night to find it broken, didn't let it slide. Instead, storming over to the neighboring studio mid-broadcast during Rickles' own taping of CPO Sharky, walking on set unannounced, holding the broken box, and confronting Rickles in front of a stunned crew and a live audience in a moment that teetered between comedy and confrontation. With Carson's smile tight, his sarcasm biting, and Rickles, the usually fearless roaster, visibly rattled as Johnny Mock scolded him with a glare that suggested this wasn't entirely a joke. And then there was the infamous nightshare sat across from Johnny, all youthful boldness and Hollywood glitter, and casually said she used to think he was a jerk. A comment meant half in jest, but one that landed like a slap, prompting Johnny to freeze, lean in, and quietly but firmly ask her to explain herself, turning what should have been a playful celebrity interview into an increasingly awkward exchange as Cher backpedaled. Carson refused to let it go, and the entire room squirmed under the weight of unscripted emotion. And the confrontation with Ray Conniff, though lesser known, was perhaps the most serious. When the musician used his airtime to denounce the Vietnam War during a patriotic-themed broadcast, catching Carson off guard and triggering a rare moment of visible anger, as Johnny interrupted, challenged Conniff, and defended his audience's right to be entertained, not lectured, his voice sharp, his tone firm. The clash ending with Carson walking off stage early and refusing to shake hands, a moment so heavy it left the air in the room still and the studio audience unsure whether to clap or stay silent. And behind the scenes, there was the decades-long Cold War between Carson and Joan Rivers, who went from beloved guest host to persona non grata after accepting her own late-night show without informing Johnny first. A betrayal so deep that Carson never forgave her, never spoke to her again, not even in her final years. A feud that, though never aired in front of the camera, cast a shadow over every interview and guest host appearance that followed. And then there were the smaller flare-ups, uncomfortable moments with difficult guests like Truman Capote, whose slurred speech and off-topic ramblings left Carson visibly annoyed, or the time Bob Hope appeared late in his career, and Johnny struggled to hide his irritation at the disconnect, the forced banter, and the sense that the old magic between them had fizzled into a scripted routine no longer fun for either of them. And while Carson was known for his ability to roll with any moment, viewers could always tell when his patience was wearing thin, his fingers tapping the desk, his eyes narrowing, his laugh sounding more like a warning than a response, and those subtle cues became legendary in their own right. Because part of Johnny's genius wasn't just in telling jokes, it was in holding the room, sensing the shift, and letting tension simmer just long enough to become television history. And whether it was a surprise walk-on, a bristling stare, a sarcastic comeback that hit too hard, or a silence that said everything, Carson's most intense arguments weren't about shouting or showdowns, they were about what happens when the man who never breaks suddenly does. When the most controlled stage in television cracks open just enough to let real emotion slip through, and in those moments, America saw not the host, but the man, flawed, frustrated, fiercely human, and that's why those rare clashes, whether humorous or heated, still live in our memories today, not just as TV drama, but as proof that even the most unflappable icon has his boiling point. And while the most well-known clashes Don Rickles' desk-breaking ambush, Cher's jerk comment, Ray Conniff's political speech, and the icy fallout with Joan Rivers stand as towering monuments to Johnny Carson's rare flashes of on-air tension, there were countless other moments that simmered just below the surface, quiet but combustible, where Johnny, known for his calm, sometimes unleashed an unmistakable warning in his tone, a cold pause in his delivery, or an icy retort that made the entire room sit up straighter, because Carson, though rarely angry in an explosive way, wielded silence and sarcasm like weapons. And when provoked, especially by guests who disrespected the show, the audience, or him personally, he made it known with just a look or a shift in his posture that he wasn't playing along. Like the night when Truman Capote, appearing increasingly intoxicated and unpredictable, rambled off topic and made guests and crew uncomfortable, and Carson, trying to salvage the segment, first laughed awkwardly, then finally cut him off mid-sentence with a biting remark and a forced commercial break, a moment that revealed how tight Johnny's leash was on his stage. And then there was the unpredictable animal chaos brought by guests like Joan Embry and Jim Fowler, whose exotic creatures occasionally caused Johnny to flinch, freeze, or lash out, not at the animals, but at the handlers, with passive-aggressive comments that suggested he didn't appreciate being thrown into wild unpredictability without a heads-up, especially when snakes wrapped around his neck or birds decided to use his shoulder as a perch. And then there were the ego battles, the subtle but sharp power plays with alpha guests, like Frank Sinatra, who, though revered by Carson, had moments where the tension crackled just beneath the surface, especially when alcohol or arrogance blurred the lines between friendly banter and personal jabs. And Johnny, though usually deferential, had a limit for how much showbiz bravado he would tolerate before cutting the guest off, or shifting the mood with a pointed joke. And similar discomfort surfaced with guests like Robert Blake, whose erratic intensity could make a fun interview spiral into something edgy, tense, and unpredictable, with Johnny retreating into short answers and poker-faced silence to regain control. And perhaps even more revealing were the moments when fellow comedians, eager to one-up the master, stepped over the line, like the time Andy Kaufman intentionally tanked a segment with a bizarre bit that confused everyone, including Carson, who later admitted off-camera how frustrating it was to interview someone who didn't respect the rhythm of live television. And though Johnny didn't argue that night, his curt responses and quick exits said everything. And one could also see his limits tested by politically charged guests, figures who came not to entertain but to make a point, like when a few unfiltered authors and controversial figures brought up topics Johnny famously avoided, like Vietnam or religion, pushing him into a corner where he'd either shift quickly into neutral territory or confront the guest with veiled sarcasm that left no doubt about his discomfort. And then there was his clash with Ayn Rand, whose rigid philosophy and intellectual arrogance made for an awkward, cold conversation in which Johnny, usually respectful, seemed visibly annoyed by her lack of warmth and conversational rhythm. And behind all of these moments was the real Carson, not the laughing, relaxed host America adored, but the fiercely intelligent, tightly wound perfectionist who saw The Tonight Show not just as a job, but as an institution, one he protected, with sharp instincts and high standards. And when those standards weren't met, he didn't explode, he froze, he sharpened, and he reminded the world that his smile wasn't always a sign of approval, that beneath the soft voice and Midwestern cool was a man who didn't suffer fools lightly, who didn't let disrespect slide, who could hold a grudge for decades and turn a bad interview into an unforgettable warning to anyone else who might think about crossing him. And even in his final years on the show, as the guests grew younger and the culture around him began to shift, Johnny still held his stage like a fortress. And when he sensed phony charm, self-importance, or arrogance, he shut it down with a joke that stung more than it amused. And that, in many ways, was Carson's real genius, not just making America laugh, but making people behave, reminding every person who sat in that guest chair that The Tonight Show was his house. And if you came in swinging, you better be ready for what happened next. Because while Johnny Carson rarely argued the way most people argue, when he did, it was unforgettable, quiet, cutting, and devastatingly effective. And that's why his most intense moments still live in legend, not because he shouted or stormed off, but because he didn't have to, because all it took was one look, one pause, one perfectly timed line to turn the whole room ice cold and remind everyone watching that while he may have been smiling, he never stopped being in control.